Pleased to be able to present Trish Fielding from Townsville Public Library. State Library of Queensland and has a real commitment to building and supporting a distributed collection of Queensland memory, of working with people, organisations, libraries, museums around the state to build a shared network of Queensland history. Queensland history is bigger than any one organisation, and we all do need to work together. And we're really pleased. We've worked with Townsville Public Library on a number of projects, including the Digital Story project that you saw earlier. And Townsville Public Library is a fantastic public library network and has got a wonderful commitment to telling the stories of Townsville and their local history. So today we have Trish Fielding, who'll discuss the impact of Flinders Street has had on the political, social and economic growth of Townsville. You know, Flinders Street is their main street, and it would be fantastic for her to be able to share that with us. Following the presentation, there will be time for audience questions. Please also be aware that the session today is being recorded, and this talk will be available on SLQ's website for all of those people who are interested but could not be here today. So let it begin. Please welcome Trish Fielding.
Now, obviously, Townsville is named after Towns, but he only visited the city once in 1866, and he was somewhat disparaging about the township that bore his name. He said of his visit to Townsville that he had never felt so unhappy from home in all his life. Towns disliked the frontier atmosphere of the settlement and was particularly critical of the locals' lack of sobriety. Early Flinders Street was little more than a rough track through mangrove swamp. It was muddy and often difficult to negotiate, being constantly damp due to the daily tides from Ross Creek that seeped into the street. The street originally extended as far as what is now the suburb of Garbett, much of what is now called Ingham Road, for those who are familiar with Townsville. Now, this is a map of Flinders Street. this is a map of Townsville, rather, representing Townsville in 1865. It shows a somewhat more orderly township than would have been the probable reality, because this is only a year after its founding, so it is meant to be representative. Now, you can see the high water mark from the creek, represented by this dashed line, which is a little hard to see on the screen there. But it's worth pointing out that about here, the Post and Telegraph Office and the Town Hall would soon be located. So it gives you an idea of how wet the street sometimes became. Also, this block here, this massive block of land, was owned by John Melton Black, and he had a house there, and it's on what's now called Melton Hill, and it would have had commanding views of the entire bay. I just wanted to also mention, actually it's difficult to make out here, but a number of these blocks of land along the Strand, here, and a good portion of Flinders Street East, the blocks were actually owned by Towns and Black, so they had quite a stake in the town. The section of Flinders Street that we now call Flinders Street East was initially the centre of development in the city. Between 1864 and 1900, structures in this area evolved from rudimentary huts to timber buildings and then to more permanent brick and masonry buildings. Gazetted a port of entry in 1865, early buildings and businesses reflected the functional nature of the new town. They supplied goods and services to the passing shipping trade, the hinterland goldfields and the pastoral industry, as well as satisfying local requirements. So this is a very early photograph. It's about 1867. And you get an idea of how muddy the street was. This is the creek here, Ross Creek. This is also shows you Ross Creek. So the settlement was on this side of the creek. This is the wharf and yard of Clifton and Applin Brothers. And this one is 1875, so it shows there's been a bit more development. The actual X on the photograph that has been marked on the photograph, possibly by the photographer, or someone who owned the photograph later is more likely. That's where the post office, the old post office stands now, which is now the brewery. So it gives you an idea of the development just in 11 years. As the main street, Flinders Street represented the focal point for the core business of the community. The gradual provision of basic services and facilities made life a little easier for the citizens of Townsville. The Municipal Council approved the lighting of the town by gas on the 20th of February 1883, and in 1885 Flinders Street was being watered by a contractor using salt water pumped from the creek near the side of the Victoria Bridge. This may have alleviated some of the problems associated with dust being kicked up by horse traffic. This slide is 1892, and it's looking from the corner of Flinders and Denham Street, looking back towards the sea. These are just a couple of examples of early buildings in Flinders Street. The top one, the Bank of New South Wales. It was erected in 1887, or that's a later photograph, but it was put up in 1887. And it still exists today. It's now Flynn's Irish Bar. The Exchange Hotel at the bottom, that photograph was taken in the 1880s. And again, on the next photo is the modern Exchange Hotel, though it's not the same building, but it's on the same site. This photograph is of the Union Bank of Australia in 1891, and it's now the Perce Tucker Gallery, and you'll notice it's got 2 stories now. The second story was added in the 1930s. Now, by around 1900, the focus of commercial activity that had characterised Flinders Street East had begun to shift further west along Flinders Street. Aside from simple population growth, a number of factors probably contributed to this shift. The establishment of the railway, the development of an outer harbour, and the construction of the Victoria Bridge all helped to facilitate growth in a westward direction. The building of the railway line commenced in 1879, with the first section of track from Townsville to Reed River opened on 20th of December 1880. By the end of 1882, the line had reached Charters Towers and as far as Hughenden by 1887. The line from the Townsville railway station to the outer harbour was completed in 1886. By December 1929, the rail line stretched as far west as Mount Isa and as far south as Brisbane. The railway opened up transport and communication to the west of the state and changed the way goods and people moved forever. Horse and coach transport was pushed to the very fringes of settlement as each new section of railway track was completed. The first Townsville railway station was in use by late 1880. Utilitarian in design, it was replaced by a more substantial building in 1913, more fitting with the stature of the Great Northern Railway. So this is the old station. And this is the new railway station, new at the time, still under construction, but very close to completion. This is a view from outside the railway station in the 1920s. You can see there's a couple of old hotels there. There's the Great Northern Hotel and also the Newmarket Hotel. It's quite a bustling little place. I mentioned the harbour. This is work on the outer harbour in Townsville around 1900. And this is one of my favourite photographs. This is the Adelaide Steamship Company's wharf in Townsville. It gives you a bit of an idea of how busy things were by 1900. And I mentioned the Victoria Bridge. This is the Victoria Bridge over Ross Creek. This is a later photograph, it's 1925. And you've got Castle Hill in the background. The Flinders Street businesses provided basic goods and services to the population, and some of the names of these businesses are still fixed in the memory of many locals today. Wilmot's Stationery Warehouse, Samuel Allen and Sons, Rooney's Hardware, Cummins and Campbell, McKimmon and Richardson's, which was later occupied by David Jones, Horn and Peterson, who were jewellers, Green's Chemists, Kodak, Walton's, Page's Cycles, Angus Smith's Sports Store, Amati's Chemists, Burt Brown and Company, Hales, Ferries, Carroll's, Coles and Woolworths all served the needs of Townsville residents at one time or another. A number of the buildings that housed these early businesses still remain today, even if they're now tenanted by different businesses. This is 1910, Flinders Street. You can see the railway station in the far background. The post office has become a landmark, basically. This tower here was for drying fire hoses. The fire station was next to it. Also, I will mention in this photograph, we actually get a small glimpse of what was then called Flinders Lane, which is now Ogden Street. And Flinders Lane was reputedly a red light district. And also may have been known as Chinatown, Townsville's Chinatown. This photograph is from 1912, and it's looking from Flinders Street. It's looking west to the corner of Denham Street in Flinders. Again, that's that bank I mentioned on the corner there. It's only got the single story. This is the Excelsior Hotel. This was the shop front of W.H. Green's Pharmacy in Flinders Street. It's taken about 1921. It's quite an elaborate looking shop front. And this is the interior of Horn and Peterson's Jewellers in 1913. Over the years, Flinders Street has served as a focal point for entertainment and refreshment, the home of theatres, hotels and cafes. Townsville's first theatre, the Theatre Royal, opened in August 1869 in a converted shop next to the Commercial Hotel in what is now Flinders Street East. Even though the settlement was only a few years old, locals were treated to performances of opera, dance, short plays and comedy sketches at the Theatre Royal. In 1874, the purpose-built theatre, the Olympic, was opened. Facing Denham Street, the hotel it was attached to, A.F. Lowe's Townsville Hotel, occupied the corner of Flinders and Denham Streets. Although rudimentary in appearance, the barn-like theatre could seat up to 800 people and attracted a variety of performers. Opera singer Anna Bishop performed 3 concerts at the Olympic Theatre in 1875. Townsville's second but more enduring Theatre Royal opened in 1900. Part of the new Town Hall complex in Flinders Street and attached to the Central Hotel, it came to be regarded as the main theatre in Townsville. The Theatre Royal saw performances by Gladys Moncrief in 1905 and Anna Pavlova in 1929, and was the venue for the North Queensland Eisteddfod in Townsville from 1906 until the theatre's closure in 1973. During the early 1900s, the Theatre Royal also showed silent moving pictures, and during intermission or film reel changes, live performers and acrobats provided entertainment. No doubt its close proximity to the Central Hotel proved convenient for any thirsty performers or theatre patrons. The Roxy Theatre was another iconic Flinders Street theatre. Originally called the City Pictures, it was an open-air theatre designed by Lynch and Hunt architects and probably built in 1917. This theatre underwent several renovations and name changes. In 1919, it was operating as the Paramount Theatre. Later, it was partially roofed and then fully roofed, and by 1934 was operating as the Roxy Theatre. So this slide shows you the Roxy Theatre. The previous slide, this is the Paramount Theatre, so that became the Roxy Theatre. And here we have the Roxy. This is in 1943. Actually, I thought that was 1942. And you can see there's slit trenches in the street, in the centre of the street, because this was the war years. And the Roxy claimed to have been the first air-conditioned theatre in the city. Junior staff bought moulds of ice across the road in Ogden Street from Vardy's Ice Works. They carried them upstairs, where they placed them in front of fans. The Roxy closed in 1969, and the site became the home of retail store Walton's and later Chandler's Electrical. Now, not all of Flinders Street's theatres were quite as enduring as the Theatre Royal and the Roxy. Located further west in Flinders Street, opposite the railway yards, the Strand Theatre was an open-air theatre that opened in 1914. This is it here. You can actually see the seating for the theatre, and it was across from the rail yards, so you can see the rail lines here. The station is all the way down here, and you've got Ross Creek there. These are the garden beds in the centre of Flinders Street that went in the 20s. Now, while many people have very fond memories of open-air theatres, they were not without their drawbacks, being vulnerable to the vagaries of the weather and offensive odours from surrounding areas. The owners of the Strand Theatre made complaints to the council about smoke from the nearby wood depot. A similar open-air theatre, the Olympia, which was situated on the corner of Sturt and Stoke Streets opposite the Herbert Hotel, complained to the council about the obnoxious smell emanating from the sanitary cart that was parked outside the theatre during performances. And unfortunately, the coming of sound to cinema spelled the end of many silent picture theatres. During the 60s and 70s, a number of amateur dramatic societies were formed in Townsville, and the Matchbox Theatre was established in a building in Flinders Street East. The Matchbox Theatre eventually became the Stage Door Theatre, home of Townsville's first resident theatre company. Flinders Street East is now a modern nightclub strip, with many heritage buildings in the street housing nightclubs, for example, the former Australian Joint Stock Bank building and the former Burns Philp and Company building. Flinders Street cafes were popular meeting places. The Geisha Cafe was located in the section of Flinders Street known as Broadway. The cafe was touted in advertisements in the 1920s as the most up-to-date cafe in North Queensland. It sold, and I quote, "a splendid assortment of high-class sweets, delicious sundaes, fruit salads, ices, jellies, ice cream sodas, and morning and afternoon teas were daintily served." I'll just go back to one of these slides to actually show you where the Geisha Cafe was located in relation to the rest of the street. That's the town hall here, and the post office down the other end. That's the Geisha Cafe. The Bluebird Cafe was for many years a favourite meeting place. Situated next to the present Westpac Bank in Flinders Street, the cafe was considered by locals as 5-star for service and food, especially pastries. This advertisement for the Bluebird Cafe is from 1925. I just would like to read out the wording on it. Visitors to the show and races should not fail to visit the most up-to-date and luxurious Bluebird Cafe when in town. The service is excellent, and tasty ice creams and sundaes, refreshing fountain drinks, and after-theatre suppers are only a few of the items on a well-filled menu. Between 1937 and 1946, Mr. and Mrs. Reg Murray operated the Austral Cafe in Flinders Street with 5 of their 6 daughters. They're pictured here. This is the interior of the Austral Cafe. The cafe was situated next to the Theatre Royal and, as well as being a favourite eating place for locals, catered to thousands of servicemen and women of varying nationalities during World War II. And hotels too played a pivotal role in Townsville's development, providing lodgings for both single working men as well as visitors to the city. Some of the hotels in Flinders Street were Tattersalls, the Exchange, the Alexandra, the Grand, the Queensland, the Central, Louth's, the Newmarket and the Great Northern, although there were many, many more. 10 of the hotels that once graced Flinders Street were destroyed by fire. They were the Albion, Alexandra, Excelsior, Exchange, the Family Hotel, Hamilton's, the Imperial, the Metropolitan, the Paragon and the Townsell Hotel. It must have been a real shame to lose those hotels to fire. This is Fredrik Kidner's Grand Hotel, which was in Flinders Street. This photograph was taken in 1913. The hotel was built in 1886. As you can see, it was 3 stories, and the balconies have absolutely beautiful cast-iron balustrades. Until its conversion to a pedestrian mall in the 1980s, Flinders Street was the focus of civic celebration in Townsville and the scene of many welcome parades and public marches attended at times by thousands of people. In 1901, the newly federated Commonwealth of Australia was in need of a national flag. A competition was held that attracted 30,000 designs. Townsville claims to have been the location of the first official raising of the Australian flag on the 16th of September 1901. Australia's first Governor-General, Lord Hopetoun, was visiting the city to officially open the new town hall, and a local sailmaker, William Mackenzie, made a replica of the newly designed flag for Lord Hopetoun to unfurl. The new flag was flown from a flagpole outside the town hall in front of a massive crowd, and the Governor-General declared, "It has afforded me very great pleasure indeed to unfurl this grand new flag, and I feel highly honoured that the first time I have been present at its unfurling should have been in Townsville, the Queen City of the North." So here we have an image of the raising of that first flag. And you can see the town hall in the background. And you can see that thousands of people are crowded into the street. Flinders Street was to play host to many more high-profile visitors. Sorry, I've missed a bit here. Officially, the Australian government recognises the 3rd of September 1901 as the first raising of the new flag, when the Governor-General's wife, Lady Hopetoun, opened an exhibition of the flag designs at the Exhibition Building in Melbourne, and the competition results were announced. But Townsville claims to have raised it first. And as I said, Flinders Street was to play host to many more high-profile visitors over the ensuing years. In 1903, the Governor of Queensland, Major General Sir Herbert Chermside, and his wife Lady Chermside received a warm welcome in Townsville with a ceremonial arch built across Flinders Street. This slide's actually celebrating the 50th anniversary of the first flag raising in Townsville, so that's 1951. It's just worth mentioning that some of these buildings are still standing today. This building here, the National Bank, is still standing. It's not in use as a bank, but it's still there. The next building, the Kodak building, is still there. This building was Wilmot's. That is now the Balcony Restaurant. That's still there. So that small section of Flinders Street is largely unchanged, those buildings. And this is the ceremonial arch that was erected for the visit of the Governor in 1903. The following year saw a visit from Lord and Lady Lamington, and again locals flocked to Flinders Street for the best vantage point. Lamington had been Governor of Queensland from 1896 to 1901. And this image really gives an indication of the popularity and importance of these kinds of visits, with so many citizens crowding into the street. In June 1911, to celebrate the coronation of King George V of England, a large procession marched through Flinders Street to St James Cathedral. The Cairns Post reported that the procession included civic authorities, consuls, friendly societies, fire brigade, police, waterside workers and the military. A special service was then conducted by the Bishop of North Queensland, and the cathedral was crowded to the doors. The shipping in port was decorated with flags, and all flags in the town were flown. A number of businesses displayed special decorations with portraits of the King and Queen. The procession halted en route at the town hall to hear a choir of 200 children sing the coronation song. 43 years later, in 1954, Her Royal Highness Queen Elizabeth II visited Townsville as part of the Australian leg of her royal tour. Flinders Street was magnificently decorated with a welcome arch that stretched across the street and read, "God bless our Queen." This is, I have to confess, probably one of my favourite photographs in the Townsville City Libraries collection. Here they are here. Prince Philip's giving everyone a wave. So this is the town hall. You'll note this portrait of the Queen atop the town hall there. The Queen and Prince Philip had flown into Townsville on the 12th of March and were treated to a display by Indigenous dancers and greeted by thousands of enthusiastic locals at the Sports Reserve in North Ward. As many as 2,000 children spelled out the words, "Welcome to Townsville," and another 2,000 formed the Australian coat of arms. This is that portrait I was just pointing out to you. This is a close-up. And you'll see that the cupola on the town hall is just looking quite resplendent in the afternoon sun there. Parades were also held in Flinders Street to farewell soldiers off to war and to celebrate peace after the conflicts were ended. This is the Kennedy Regiment marching across the Victoria Bridge after having been through Flinders Street on their way towards the harbour, departing for Thursday Island in August 1914. And here they are, the Kennedy Regiment boarding the SS Kanowna for Thursday Island as well. These next two slides are from the Armistice Day Parade in 1918. And again, this building is still standing. Unfortunately, this one's not. This was the Alexandra Hotel. And again, you've got the single-storey Union Bank there. These businesses here were quite long-standing. Burt Brown. And that's the same parade. And you can see that this crowd's just stretching out into the distance. Just thousands and thousands of people. The end of World War II prompted crowds of people to gather in Flinders Street to celebrate the announcement of peace. The Townsville Daily Bulletin reported that upon receiving the news of Japan's defeat, and I quote, "There was a spontaneous movement spontaneous movement of jubilation, hilarity and joy. Offices and shops were emptied of their occupants and joy ran riot. The bulletin wrote, "Knots of citizens of all ages and sexes intermingled in a jubilant throng. Streamers were soon thrown from the windows, scraps of paper were transformed into confetti and thrown from the first and second floors of buildings." Excited crowds marched informally through Flinders Street shortly after the announcement of peace in August 1945, and total strangers shook hands and linked arms in what must have seemed like an endless procession. After almost 6 years in the shadow of war, the people of Townsville happily expressed their joy and relief that the war was finally over. This one shows crowds in Flinders Street after the announcement of peace, and there's quite a number of people standing on top of an air raid shelter. This was the Carrolls building. This photo shows a voluntary aid detachment marching at the corner of Flinders and Denham Streets. In 1963, an Anzac Day Parade. You'll note that the post office on the left of the photograph is missing its clock tower. When Darwin was bombed in February 1942, the clock tower on the Townsville post office was hurriedly dismantled in case it became a target for Japanese bombs. It was not until 1963-64 that a new modified clock tower was built at a cost of just over £42,000. And Flinders Street was often the scene of political protests, with the Tree of Knowledge at the corner of Flinders and Denham Streets the location for many meetings and speeches. In 1919, Flinders Street was the scene of civil unrest that was the result of one of the most bitterly fought industrial battles in Australian history. A prolonged period of industrial dispute between striking meat workers and their employers led to an all-out gun battle in the city. The background to the dispute was an attempt by the meat export companies to reduce the Australian meat industry employees' unions' power in the meatworks and to force them to agree to compulsory arbitration. The trouble began in 1918 when economic conditions in Townsville were steadily declining, with sharply rising prices and high unemployment. By early 1919, post-war conditions appeared bleak. Argument over the use of non-union labour caused strike after strike, and on the 28th of June 1919, a group of 300 men raided cattle yards at the Stewart, releasing 500 head of cattle, which belonged to the Queensland Meat Export Company. The purported ringleaders were arrested and placed in the Townsville lockup and refused bail. An angry crowd of 3,000 men assembled at the Tree of Knowledge, pictured here. And after some fiery speeches had whipped the crowd into a frenzy, the mob moved onto the lockup to demand the release of the men. Shots were fired. A scuffle broke out, resulting in gunfire from both sides, and 9 men were wounded. Shots were fired again the following morning when Unionists gathered again at the Tree of Knowledge. This time they were armed with rifles, knives and razors. The angry mob had raided the establishments of Rooney's and Alfred Shaw's for weapons, ammunition and other goods to the value of £1,200. The state government authorised the confiscation of all firearms and ammunition in the Townsville district, and all available police were sent to the city to restore order. The incident came to be known as Bloody Sunday. In 1929, 3 men were charged with addressing a meeting without a permit at the Tree of Knowledge when police interrupted a meeting of the Communist Party. The newspaper headline read, "Communists Arrested," and quoted the party's organising secretary, Joseph Shelley, as saying, "Well, that's about the shortest speech I've ever made in my life." Despite the fact that the Tree of Knowledge was used almost weekly as a meeting place by the Communist Party at this time, Sub-Inspector O'Sullivan had refused to grant Shelley a permit. Perhaps fittingly, Shelley chose that particular evening to address the 300-strong crowd on the question of free speech. And Shelley was fined £20. In May 1948, a crowd of about 300 listened to an address by Mr Arthur Caldwell, the Minister for Information and Immigration, at the Tree of Knowledge. Caldwell was addressing the crowd on a referendum that would give the Commonwealth Government ongoing powers with respect to rents and prices. The referendum was defeated. It would appear that the gatherings at the Tree of Knowledge were both a source of information and also public entertainment. At a time when television was yet to make demands on people's time, public meetings were well attended and often the scene of spirited discussion. Retired union organiser Fred Thompson recalled rallies under the tree in the 1950s where it was impossible to have a meeting without being heckled. He thought that some of the gatherings were as good as a stage show. Some other well-known speakers under the tree included lawyer Fred Patterson, who became Australia's first Communist Party MP, and MP Tom Aikens, who was known as the voice of the North and is best remembered for riding his bicycle around Townsville to visit his constituents. Not that public meetings were confined to the Tree of Knowledge. On the 10th of August 1917, a largely attended open-air meeting, convened by the Combined Railway Union's Strike Committee, was held at the intersection of Flinders and Stanley Streets for the purpose of informing the public of the reasons and position of the current railwaymen's strike. Apparently the principal cause of the strike on that occasion was the question of retrospective pay. And on the 19th of August that same year, Unionists met at the Strand Theatre on Flinders Street West, situated opposite the railway yards. This is a photograph of that meeting. Now, Flinders Street's close proximity to Ross Creek, where wharves were situated, also provided a breeding ground for rats, and in 1900, Townsville experienced its first outbreak of bubonic plague. The first case of plague arrived on the 27th of April aboard the steamship Sintra, and passengers were quarantined at West Point on Magnetic Island. One of the ship's stewards, Walter Guard, who was the second person to fall ill, died on Magnetic Island. Between May and October, the outbreak claimed 9 lives and prompted the authorities to build a temporary isolation hospital on the town common. The proprietor of the commercial hotel in Flinders Street, which is now the site of the Mad Cow Tavern, Mr. Thomas McLean, died from plague at his hotel on the 30th of August 1900. The plague continued to visit North Queensland towns over the next 20 years, but the first year, 1900, was the worst. And the plague outbreak in Townsville caused the local council to consider the sanitary condition of the city, and gradually improvements were made. In 1935, plans were drawn of the Flinders Street area with a view to constructing an expensive sewage system. I hope you can make this one out. This is one of these plans that was drawn in 1935 for the sewage scheme. 5 of these plans have been reproduced in a smaller A3 fold-out format in the back of the publication Flinders Street Townsville, a Pictorial History. I'm a bit excited about these plans. The originals are held by CityLibraries, and they are in themselves almost a work of art. The plans were produced with ink on a reinforced pale blue linen, so they're quite something to see in the flesh, I must say. They're extremely detailed, and they give the names of shop owners and business names, but also note gas inlets, sheds, kitchens, and even outhouses. It's a bit difficult to make out on the screen there. The attention to detail of these plans is so remarkable that a lean-to behind Louth's Hotel, marked on one plan, can in fact be identified in a photograph of men working on the sewage drain behind the hotel in Stanley Street. So this is a close-up of one of those plans. And you'll see here I've marked in red there's a lean-to. This is Louth's Hotel. So this is Flinders Street along here. So you've got Louth's Hotel on this corner and the state government buildings on the next corner. So there's marked here a lean-to. So this is where the sewage line was going to go, crossing through Sturt Street there. So this is the lean-to I'm talking about. I'm getting excited about the lean-to because I think that this lean-to is right here in this photograph. So you've got the state government offices here, and this is the hotel. So these guys were actually digging the drains for that. In 1942, Townsville was roused from its tropical slumber to find itself a major staging point for the Allied War in the Pacific. Although World War II started in September 1939, it wasn't until the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 1941 and the fall of Singapore in February 1942 that Townsville began to fear the prospect of having the war on its doorstep. Singapore was considered the last bastion of defence against the advancing Japanese army, and Australia had accepted Britain's assurances that it could defend and hold Singapore. After the fall of Singapore, Townsville began its transformation into a garrison city. The build-up of military forces in 1942 placed a considerable strain on both the resources and the people of Townsville. Military personnel outnumbered civilians by 3 to 1. Residential and business premises were commandeered for military use, and between 5,000 and 7,000 people voluntarily evacuated south or to other regional centres. Drastic shortages of ice, fresh milk, firewood and fuel, coupled with inflated prices for fruit and vegetables, contributed to an air of tension between civilians and the military. Ice was a crucial commodity, as very few homes at this time had any kind of refrigeration. In December 1943, at Vardy's Iceworks in Ogden Street, up to 1,500 people queued from as early as 3 a.m. in order to secure a block of ice, and many went home empty-handed. Aside from the strict rationing of basic goods and services, Townsville's population was affected socially as well. Concerns about sexual promiscuity, prostitution, venereal disease and violence between Australian and American servicemen occupied the public consciousness. The next few slides show the progression of Flinders Street during the 1950s, 60s and 70s. This building here was the McKimmon's building. Earlier it was called McKimmon and Richardson's, then it became McKimmon's. And this was where David Jones was located for many years. Again, this is a view from the town hall. This is about 1960, judging by the age of those Holdens there. Could be late 50s. This was the Queensland Hotel. And this is an image of the city buildings and the town hall in the 1970s. So you can see, we've very much got old and new here. You've got the city buildings, the town hall, and then in the background you've got what was the SGIO building, and it's now the Holiday Inn, known affectionately by locals as the Sugar Shaker because of its shape. The town hall is still standing. It was gutted by fire, however, in 1978. Construction of the Flinders Mall began in September 79, and by 1980 this section of the street had undergone a complete transformation. Again, I think this photograph is late 1970s, and it just gives you a bit more of a vista down the street itself. That's the T&G building in the background, which no longer exists. It was demolished to make way for some development, but it still stands as a vacant block today, somewhat disappointingly. This is the Burns-Philp building in Flinders Street in the late 1970s. It is looking a little tired and neglected, but I'm happy to say it doesn't look like that today. It's very, very nicely looked after on the outside today, although it does house a nightclub. So, now, this is a parade in Flinders Street in the late 1970s. I suspect that it's probably a Pacific Festival parade. As early as 1963, the Townsville City Council, under the leadership of Mayor Angus Smith, was looking at ways to revitalise the Flinders Street section of the central business district. In November, property owners in the CBD area, bounded by Flinders, Stokes, Sturt and Stanley Streets, met with the Mayor to discuss the possibility of constructing a pedestrian mall. It wasn't until 1970 that the Council decided to commission a feasibility study for the central city area to provide for a multi-million-dollar shopping mall with the possibility of closing part of Flinders Street. The concept of a pedestrian mall was not a particularly popular one, and one council alderman, Eric Gray, was quoted by the Townsville Daily Bulletin in 1972 as saying that if Flinders Street were closed to traffic, it would be, and I quote, more like a morgue. Which unfortunately some years later turned out to be relatively prophetic, actually. The trend of suburban shopping centres was luring shoppers away from the central business district, and the pedestrian shopping mall was seen as the best way to bring shoppers back into the city. Construction on stage one of the Flinders Mall began in September 1979. The mall was constructed by the council's day labour workforce. By the time of the mall's official opening in June 1980, an estimated 600,000 interlocking pavers had been laid in Flinders Street between Denham and Stanley Streets, and the pedestrian mall was complete. So here you have the mall as it looked in 1980, very colourful. Unfortunately, pedestrian malls are no longer in vogue today, and by the turn of the 21st century, this once vibrant, life-filled street had become an eyesore, full of empty shops, visited only by a few locals and shocked tourists. In 2010, Flinders Street began a process of rebirth with the commencement of the Flinders Street redevelopment. This year, the first cars in 30 years were allowed to drive through Flinders Street. On the 13th of August, the street was officially reopened after a $56 million makeover. The street is once again open to vehicular traffic, and already the crowds are starting to return. Flinders Street shows every sign of once again taking its rightful place as the beating heart of the city of Townsville. Thank you.
Thank you, Trisha. That was absolutely fantastic. So many, such richness in the presentation, so much research, so seamlessly presented. So thank you. We have some time for questions. Is there any burning questions? Mary?
I have a burning question about all the hotels that burned down. I wondered whether there tended to be a common cause for these fires, or were they all due to some other?
A lot of them were timber buildings, so just basically they were a fire hazard, really, to be quite honest. And once they got some age to them, they just went up in smoke if there was any kind of accident happened in the kitchen or anything like that. So it happened to other buildings as well. As I mentioned, the town hall went through a series of fires in the 1970s. The fire would start in a bakery and things like that, and then just make an incredible amount of damage. And I think it's because they were timber buildings.
We have a couple maybe at the back and then down here.
The Tree of Knowledge. Can you tell me when that was first named, the Tree of Knowledge, and was there a particular event that triggered the naming?
I'm not sure when it was first named, the Tree of Knowledge, although it did exist from quite early days. From the research I've done, it appears there was two, in fact, trees of knowledge. I found some newspaper articles that said that the tree had died, so they took it away, and that was in the 1920s. But then, of course, some of those photos I was showing you were after that, and then I've also seen photographs of the council cutting the tree down in the 1970s, so someone came along and replanted it, obviously. And I think because it had such an association with those public meetings, people felt they sort of had some ownership over it.
I understand an old telecommunications centre from World War II has been discovered under the old Commonwealth Bank building in Townsell in Flinders Street. Can you tell us anything about that?
I don't know a great deal about it, only that it's not a bunker as such, but it is in a room underneath that building. I'm just trying to think. I think there's some... If I just go back... See if I can find a picture. This is the building in question. That building there, it's still there today. I don't know a lot about it, I know what I've seen in the newspaper. It was apparently a backup communications room in case the main backup was knocked out by bombing or anything that might have happened in the war. But that building's still there, although it's not occupied and somewhat derelict inside, I believe, unfortunately. Hopefully somebody would do something with it soon.
Could you tell me if Louth's Hotel is still...
Louth's Hotel? No, Louth's Hotel isn't there anymore. I think it's called it might be the Plaza Hotel or something. There's a much more modern building there now. Yeah.
Yeah, can you tell me something about the Sugar Shaker? When it was built, is it under any sort of preservation order these days? Is it an example of 70s architecture or anything like that?
Look, I'm not aware that it is under any sort of preservation. It's recently undergone a refurbishment inside, apparently, so it's all very nice inside. It was built in the late 1970s, I think.
79 image had it.
It was completed in 1977, that building. I did actually have some construction photographs of that, but I didn't include them because I felt that the PowerPoint was getting a little bit out of hand with the number of slides. But the construction of that is actually quite interesting. The photographs of that being constructed shows a column going up the centre of the building where the lifts are, and you can see that that's actually under construction. So they're very interesting photographs. And if you're interested in those, that set of photographs are actually on the City Libraries website. So you'd be able to have a look at those if you wanted.
So another question? Oh, Fumi, if you were. Pass the mic. That means we catch the mic on the question.
You know roughly when a public ferry service started to be run up to Magnetic Island from bottom end of Flinders Street?
No, I don't, unfortunately. I would only be guessing. It was quite early. Yeah. I'm sorry.
I think there was one further back, the gentleman in there.
Are these photos available on the website?
Yes, I'm just thinking trying to think whether they're all available on the website.
I'm particularly
Most of them would be, yeah.
I'm particularly interested in the photo of the Armistice Day Parade.
Yes, there's a whole series of those. In fact, there's in various stages of the street, so there's plenty of those, and they are available on the website.
It's the council's library website.
Yeah, if you go to the Townsell City Council website and then find the link for the city libraries, you'll be able to find them. And if you just put in the keywords parade and Flinders Street, it brings up lots of parades. And if you put in Armistice Day Parade, it will bring up those specific ones.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Trisha, for the very interesting talk and the excellent illustrations. Just out of interest, the Queensland State Archives has a web presentation at the moment on early photographs of Townsville, and different from these, but it has an early...
I haven't seen that.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Okay.
Secondly, you made a point of saying as the west was opened, with the railway line extending further and further west, that by 1900 the railway link was complete through to Cloncurry and to Brisbane. The rail line, in fact, to Brisbane didn't come through till 1920. People were still travelling by boat from, certainly from Bowen, north in those days, because all the railway lines went on fingers from the coast due west, and it was only quite late that they were connected, and was certainly 1918, 1920 that the final link was made.
Okay, yeah. I might have made a mistake with that one, yeah. I thought 1929 it was connected to Mount Isa by 1929, but I'd have to check that, yeah. Thanks for that.
Well, thank you. One more question, maybe.
When you mentioned about the play, how was the news in Australia? Just was in Townsville, or because I never heard about that in Australia.
Oh yeah, it was throughout Australia, mainly up the eastern coast of Australia. It started in Sydney. The first ever plague case in Australia was in January 1900, and that was in Sydney. And within months, it had made its way up the eastern coast to Queensland, and it wasn't. I think it was was it April in 1900 that it arrived in Townsville. There was also plague in Cairns. Yes, definitely, also Brisbane, yeah. So all throughout the coast. And the Queensland government set about building temporary plague hospitals in most centres up the coast. Townsville's is a bit of a mystery, I've got to say. It was located on the town common, but it was never officially gazetted as a hospital. It didn't exist for very long. And interestingly enough, there was also a cemetery associated with that plague hospital, and there may be as many as possibly 7 people buried out there somewhere. But no one knows where it is, but it's not for the want of looking, that's for sure. But it's a very interesting piece of Townsville's history, and Queensland's history, in fact. The interesting part about it that I find is that in Townsville, no one panicked. It was a bubonic plague, and yet the locals didn't actually believe it was bubonic plague. They thought it was typhoid, they thought it was this, they thought it was that. They didn't want to believe that it was actually plague. And they gave the local doctors a really hard time. Dr. Turner came up from Brisbane. He was a very respected medical man, and he came up from Brisbane to try and halt the plague in North Queensland, basically. And he encountered quite a hostile council and a hostile public. He and the local medical officer, Dr. Linford Rowe, had quite the time of it. They attempted to introduce sanitary measures that would help the city, and they kept coming up against obstacles over and over. At one stage, quite late in the piece in about August, so the plague outbreak had almost exhausted itself by then, but they attempted to take one young man to the plague hospital, and his father resisted, holding them at bay at gunpoint. And the police arrived, and a crowd of several hundred actually were at this man's house in West End, the suburb of West End. And he said, "No, you're not taking my son." His son was a grown-up by that stage. He said, "You're not taking my son to the plague hospital." And this went on for about 10 days, I think, until eventually he agreed to allow his son to go to the hospital. But there was quite a furore over the fact that they had so much power to say, "Well, we're going to take you to the plague hospital. We need to isolate them." So it's interesting the way that people denied that it was plague, because it did mean that it was going to impact on their lives quite heavily in terms of quarantine issues. Sorry, I've gone on a bit about that. It's a bit of a pet subject, that one, so sorry.
Well, if everyone can give Trisha another round of applause. Because Trisha's come down from Townsville, and it's been great to have her here and to hear firsthand some of the work that she's doing, but also there is a very vibrant local history scene in Townsville, and it's been great to hear and share that information. As I mentioned earlier, we're recording all of these talks, and it will be available as an SLQ webcast on our webcast page. As I mentioned, this is part of a series, and next month, so it's the third Wednesday of every month, except this month because of ECA and the public holiday. So next month we have a presentation by Tracy Avery, who'll be discussing furnishing Queensland interiors in the late 19th century. I think, as all of us would be aware, we are quite aware of what exterior buildings look like, but what were the interiors like? Much less photographed, much less known. So it should be a fantastic talk. If you can come back, that would be great. So thanks for coming. Hope you enjoy the rest of the day, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you. Apply this year, but I chickened out.
Oh, did you? Oh, you should.
I did find it.
Yes.